Great. Shall we let's get started? So the original idea for this was to do it as a sort of reading group, sort of like a reading of Capitalist Realism. I mean, the reason we want to do it is because Mark Fisher was at the last, fast forward 2 years ago, not here now, unfortunately committed suicide earlier this year. And we've been trying to think about ways in which we can sort of try to embed Mark's ideas within the practices of Plan C and further afield. So that's the sort of idea of why we decided that we want to do this. Who's read Capitalist Realism? Can you put your hands up? Great. Who's read it? Keep your hands up if you've read it in like the last couple of months. Great. I went down to Birmingham, so we did a reading group of it in Birmingham a couple of months ago, and so I went back and reread Capitalist Realism for the first time since it came out, and it was great. Like really, a great thing to go back and read. And so basically, I'm just going to sort of like riff off Capitalist Realism, and then sort of talk a little bit about how Marx's ideas were changing, because I think there's three sort of contexts for Capitalist Realism. It was written in one context, then it was sort of received in a different context, right, around 2010, and perhaps now we're in a completely different context again, right? So one of the questions is, well, are we still in the world of Capitalist Realism? Are these ideas still useful? And so when we do that, we'll try to think about how Marx was changing his ideas after Capitalist Realism. So to start off with, this is the context in which Marx wrote the book. So it's published in 2009, but a lot of the contents are drawn from blog posts that Marx was doing from like 2005 onwards, and like a lot of conversations that were going on in that sort of theory blog circle that happened at that time. Marx's pretty explicit in the book that he's drawing on his experiences of teaching in further education. He's pretty upfront with his struggles with mental distress, etc., and quite related to teaching in further education. So it's no surprise that the two main targets of the book are what he calls market Stalinism, basically. Sort of neoliberal managerialism, that sort of constant measuring, comparing yourself to other people, etc., which just sweep through public services. He calls it market Stalinism. And the other main target is how to defeat the privatization of stress, how to repoliticize mental health, mental distress, psychological distress, etc. I think the reason the book was really struck home with people, there's been lots of books about neoliberalism, but it was one of the books that focused on like the impact on human beings of what you might call cybernetic neoliberalism, the impact on people's everyday experiences. Obviously, Mark being Mark, he not only managed to sum those experiences up, he also managed to draw on theory to sort of accelerate those experiences and to clarify them a little more, I think. So that's sort of like the context. We can see the context he was writing it in what he was writing about. But there's also, I think, we can look at like some of the theoretical tools he was drawing on. They're also sort of their time, I think. The name Capitalist Realism is not incidental, it's a play on socialist realism. One of the big influences at that time for Marx was Slavoj Žižek, basically. And Slavoj Žižek grows up and does his first work, like theoretical work, in Yugoslavia, like in the dog days of the sort of Stalinist actually existing socialism, which doesn't actually exist anymore. And the most useful part of Žižek's stick around to the late 90s and into the early 2000s was this basically drawing some sort of comparisons between the sort of the regimes of regulation and governance in Stalinism, in the actually existing socialism, drawing comparisons from that with neoliberal managerialism. And this is why he sort of started calling it market Stalinism, etc. So there's loads of really great discussion about this sort of Kafkaesque traps you get trapped in trying to perform trying to perform all of this measurement. No one's going to ever read this measurement. It didn't go anywhere. And you're always performing for the big other, which is like this Zizek-Lacanian thing. You know, this idea that there's something we have to perform to, but it doesn't actually exist, etc. It's great. I'm not going to go into those ideas too much, but like I think that's part of what really struck basically this comparison between market Stalinism that we existing and Stalinist Stalinism. And it's a good point of attack for neoliberalism because it sort of brings out the difference between the stories that neoliberalism tells about itself and our actual experiences that we live it every day. They never match up to the stories that it tells about itself. And the stories it tells about itself is about, you know, it's about innovation, creativity, it's about freedom. Get rid of that red tape in order to produce freedom. That's not what we had. That's not what it resulted. We ended up absolutely buried in a different sort of red tape. In the book, he makes this statement. I'll just read that. He says, "It would be a mistake to regard this market Stalinism, neoliberal governance, as some deviation from the true spirit of capitalism. On the contrary, it would be better to say the essential dimension of Stalinism was inhibited by its association with a social project like socialism, and can only emerge in a late capitalist culture in which images acquire autonomous force." So he's saying, you know, the sort of forms of governance under Stalinism, that was just a precursor. It needed to break with socialism, and it's only under sort of neoliberal capitalism it can come to its full horrendous potential. So that's one of the that's more of the context that the book was written in. Although I'm drawing there from sort of like, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1990, globalization, etc., right up until, well, we don't know when until. But for Mark, I think I watched a video that he did where he revisited capitalist realism, and he was really explicit. He said, you know, capitalist realism is actually about New Labour, about the New Labour project, which puts a slightly later sort of context. I think that's an interesting one it's an interesting thing to think through. That it was like New Labour was the epitome of capitalist realism. Like, I want to put forward my own argument here, which is I'm really interested in, like, you have different political generations that form. The third way New Labour left was a political generation. It was a political generation of the left, even though it had fairly right-wing politics. Right? I think political generations are formed by events, by like these periods of really sudden, rapid change, which basically crystallise longer periods of change. And, you know, depending how old you are or how many resources you've got, at that point you have a different experience of this event, and that forms generational differences, political generational differences. The third way left was formed by the fall of the Berlin Wall, by the doubling of the labour force, the global labour force in 2 years, in the early 90s, etc., which massively, and neoliberal globalisation, which massively restricted the possibilities of the left. And if you look at the new Labour left now, or, you know, the third way left, you know, they just cannot come to terms with the fact that they don't live in that world. We've had previous events since then. So that's the context the book was written in. It was received into a different context, and it was different because there was another event. There was the event of the 2007-2008 crisis. That is the generational forming event of our time. Right? So it gets released, he writes it gets published in 2009. So 2008 is the sort of economic crisis. But in order to form a political generation, you need a movement to give it political form. Right? You have a big break in people's experiences in 2008, but you need a political movement, and it's only 2011 where a new political form starts to emerge. 2011 is a huge range of protests, camps, movement of the camps, etc., etc. In the UK, you know, the high point was probably the student movement of 2010. Perhaps you could roll that over into the riots of 2011, etc. But particularly the student movement of 2010 was the context in which capitalist realism was received into. And so it's interesting to think about not just the impact, we can discuss altogether the impact that capitalist realism had on that student movement. But it's also interesting to think about what the impact of this movement and, you know, the start of this whole sort of growth of a new generation of the left had on Mark. Partly because I think you can sort of see 2011 and perhaps events since then as sort of cracks in capitalist realism. Perhaps actually the Jeremy Corbyn, the election in 2016 is when you say, yeah, this is something where capitalist realism exists, but it's the cracks are wide open. You can see beyond it, basically. So one of the things that Marx started to change his mind about after capitalist realism was he started to really reassess, become much more enthusiastic about the countercultures of the 60s, 70s, probably 80s, but 60s and 70s were the ones that Mark was actually quite hostile to. Right? He had a sort of like post-punk sensibility, which means that you should be hostile to the hippies of the 60s and 70s, right? But then he started to reassess that and become really enthusiastic about it. And it's interesting to think why that is. It sort of makes sense to me why he suddenly became interested in the 60s counterculture, which is what you just would not associate with Marx or music taste. And I think it goes something like that, is that for like 20 years, all of those experiences of the counterculture of the 60s and 70s were they were hidden underneath this idea of capitalist realism. There's an idea, like the general story told about the 1970s in the UK, basically, well, there's only one story. It's like the winter of discontent. Punk rock fits into that. The unions went too far. Punks were no future. We can't stand this anymore. Margaret Thatcher comes along and sorts it all out. I mean, sometimes you may be a little bit more hostile to Thatcher, but that's the narrative, basically. The counterculture, yeah, it was a nice idea, but it fell into hippie selfishness, and therefore automatically it was always going to end in neoliberalism. That's a story that's hard to maintain. It's easy to maintain when you think neoliberalism is the end of history, right? When you don't think it's a historical period, it's a start and an end. And it was a contingent event. It may or may not have happened, depending on how things went. So now it's a really good time, now that neoliberalism is obviously a historical period, right, which has a beginning and an end, was not necessarily inevitable, right? You can then go back and look at, unearth all of these potentials in this counterculture, which could have gone in, a huge amount of different ways. Which I think is what he's doing when he's thinking about acid communism, etc., etc. Okay, I'll talk about, let me do this bit. So doing these stories, right, I've got going back to look and reassess the counterculture. It's one of the other projects. One of the projects of Marx, all of Marx's writing, is to try to not take neoliberalism as its word, basically, to try to undermine the stories that neoliberalism tells about itself and the ones that we tell about ourselves. In the opening essay of Capitalist Realism, there's a discussion of Children of Men, the film Children of Men. And Marx argues that he says, look, the premise of the story of the book and then the film is that mankind becomes infertile. Nobody can have any more babies. He says, look, that's got to be read as a metaphor, basically, a metaphor for our time now. He says, the question the film poses is, how long can a culture persist without the new? What happens if the young are no longer capable of producing surprises? This theme that he started to then talk about as a reassessment of the counterculture as populist modernism, and in order to have a reassessment of present-day society as one of stagnation, cultural stagnation, in lots of ways actually technological stagnation as well. That becomes easy to see because we also have economic stagnation since the 2008. This is not the story that neoliberalism tells by itself. It tells us a story of innovation, etc., etc. There's this controversial argument that Marx makes in Ghosts of My Life, which is a book, this second book he wrote. And he says, look, we can prove that culture has changed and become in some ways more stagnant. He's not saying that there's no new music happening, but there's that new music and new culture doesn't come along, build up to a wave, it then becomes a fracture and creates a big explosion of the new. And he argues that that is what happened. There was a 13-year subcultural cycle that happened 1950, 1963, 1976, 1989, 1950, rock and roll, psychedelia in 1963 at the birth of it, punk rock 1976, house music 1989. He says that subcultural cycle loses coherence in the late 1990s, probably early 2000s. He says you can sort of prove that by doing a thought experiment. He says if you could take somebody from 13 years ago, time travel them to now and play them the music that's around now, they would be fucking shocked, but only shocked by how little it's changed. Not that it's not new music, but it's new music, you know, following along in a theme that was which was actually there in 13 years ago. It's a difficult argument to make, especially for me, because it sounds like a grumpy old man whinge, basically, of things were better in my day. But I think it is important. Right? He argues that it's important because we don't recognise what was lost. And what was lost during this period that he called popular modernism. And I'll explain that in a moment. What was lost was that the working class had a huge impact on defining and producing its own culture. And in fact, leading cultural production, not just for itself, but around the world, basically. He talks about popular modernism because of this obsession with creating the new. Modernism is like this drive to create the new. It involves these big breaks and ruptures where things get played out and the new emerges in a big burst, etc. Modernism normally associated with high art, literature, architecture, etc. And populist modernism is the way that avant-garde ideas and practices got reworked and extended and recirculated through popular culture. It's a sort of model of the sort of like post-war era that takes mod as its sort of like point of origin in some ways, mod as in the modernists, and then there's a sort of an extension of that when it reaches perhaps its high point, who knows, in the sort of 1980s post-punk culture, perhaps actually in the sort of 1990s sort of hardcore continuum, etc., etc. Anyway, the next thing I want to talk about is acid communism, the bit that everyone's been waiting for. And because that was the other idea that Mark was working on, and he was working on a book called Acid Communism when he died. And it's intimately linked to this idea of reassessing the counterculture of the 60s and the 70s. It actually sort of half grew out of some experiments that Plan C were doing around consciousness raising groups. So we proposed that people form consciousness raising groups, with the idea of people meet. I mean, it's taken from the feminist movement of the 1970s. People meet up and talk about your problems, and you sort of try to recognise the commonalities of your problems, and then you try to relate them to structural causes. Something that's like drastically missing in our contemporary world. We were talking about this, and Mark started to take it up. He started to talk about, well, actually, perhaps capitalist realism is consciousness deflation. Perhaps there's an active project of consciousness deflation, trying to remove all of this expanded consciousness that happened in the 1970s. And when he talked about the sort of consciousness raising that was going on in the 1970s, he had in mind feminist consciousness raising groups. He also had in mind the various forms in which class consciousness was raised, right? Partly by culture, partly by the level of militant activity, etc. But one of the interesting things Leipzig then did was to talk about psychedelia as consciousness raising, right? And he had this idea that so acid and the effects of acid had this, in a sort of diffuse way, had this effect of showing that the world was malleable, right? It was plastic. Right? There wasn't just one world, right? The world could be different in various ways. And he had in mind quite a diffuse format. It's not just people who took acid, right? took acid every day for 2 years. It was part of the culture. So the Beatles took acid, and then that sort of like experience informed their music, and so in that way it diffused out away from just people who'd taken acid who were part of the counterculture. It became the idea that the world is malleable and changeable, diffused throughout society. There's lots of dangers in that, and if you go back and look at the actual counterculture, I've been reading around a little bit around the effect that acid had on the New Left, particularly in America. And it's a really mixed story actually. It's a mixed story. In some ways, it acted as this incredible accelerant, acid. It sort of really accelerated left militancy. It really accelerated the idea that like change was going to happen, and it was going to happen soon. You know what I mean? There's this book by Lee and Shane called Acid Dreams. It's better than the title. The title suggests actually, and it looks at this sort of history, and they look at this group called the Weather Underground, who are like, they came out of the Student for Democratic Society. They were part of this. The SDS was this huge organisation, had 100,000 members, I think, really influential, and then it sort of broke up into various factions, including the Weather Underground. And all the leaders of the Weather Underground were doing a lot of acid at the time, and they argued that like it became. There were a couple of problems with acid. Is that it forms a real sort of bond between those who have turned on and taken acid and those who haven't. Straight world. There's a real division point. So it's really quite easy to see how like something like the Weather Underground, who went on to do well. They were on the verge of doing terrorist acts, as in planting bombs to kill people at a dance. The bomb blew up, they blew themselves up, and that was the only people they killed. Then they decided to do something different. But like
the remaining ones.
No, it was they were very, very careful not to kill anyone or hurt anyone from that point onwards. A bit fucking late. And so they've got. He's saying like, look, this is part of this acceleration and this feeling of a gap between you and straight society. Like this fed into this sort of drive towards militancy that you do get in movements which suffer repression, etc., etc. There's a really interesting story about the Weather Undermen had this idea. They were quite cultish, basically. They always do acid together, and one of the reasons they did acid together was to try to out the undercover cops in the organisation. And they actually.
That's a really good way to do that.
No, but let me tell you the story, because they did it. They all did acid. The undercover cop in a room broke down and said, I admit it, I'm a pig, I'm a fucking pig. And then they spent like hours talking themselves around saying, he's just paranoid. And 2 weeks later, he fucking basically fingered 2 people, he got arrested, and like, revealed himself as an undercover cop. Good crack. So anyway, we're having an acid session here to root out the new Mark Kennedys later. I was having a little chat with a friend of mine earlier, and we were talking about sort of like what are the equivalents of that acid? What have been the equivalents since then? We were talking a little bit about ecstasy and the role that ecstasy played in the early 1990s. It's quite a different drug, actually, ecstasy. It's, you can sort of see it as like the obliteration of antagonism, and lots of politics grew out of that of rave culture, partly to find someone to have a rave. But the actual affect, of doing ecstasy together, like, didn't lead to politics. It led to like, let's all why can't we all just get along, sort of thing, Whereas acid did lend itself to a sort of very, to a politics of making real hard sort of divisions. I also think we could think about like social media as the equivalent of acid. It often feels like I've taken acid going on Twitter, for instance. But it acts as an accelerant, right? But it's also got real, and so it's really valuable. You can't just chuck it away, But it's got real problems associated with it. Obviously, as we all know, it's got certain affects which do not lead to healthy cultures, etc. You can sort of think of it as some sort of equivalent to acid. I just want to now talk a little bit about. So that's where Marx's ideas were going, and in part because of the new context in which his ideas were received into. Marx didn't live to see the general election, and then the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing, this whole what seems to be a shift towards the left amongst young kids. I mean, it was the whole general election campaign was just insane. I mean, there were 2 terrorist bombings. Grenfell happens just afterwards. You know, it's a real cycle. It really did feel like one of those sort of events where like something's going on here. I don't know whether it was an event. You can only tell later on whether something emerges out of it, and I'm not clear whether it has. But it started to make me think of, you know, well, it started to make me think, well, is this a new counterculture? Will a new counterculture emerge out of all this like left hegemony? Is it possible for a new counterculture to emerge? Is it actually desirable for a counterculture to emerge? Do we need one? You know, now we can just elect Jeremy. Do we need social movements and a counterculture? Well, yeah, we do. That's my argument, because like part of the social movements and the counterculture of something like the 1970s involved this huge, diffuse experiment with new ways of living. Right? It's about pushing out what is possible. Right? It faces outwards to like new possibility, whereas electoral politics has to face back to what is possible. Right? It has to tack back to what is possible. Doesn't mean that electoral politics can't shift the bounds of possibility, but it operates in a different way to like a counterculture, etc. Thinking about whether a new counterculture can emerge, it's really interesting to think about, well, why did it disappear? I was reading a book by Ellen Willis called Beginning to See the Light. I was reading it because it's on Mark's acid communism syllabus, and I've been trying to work through those books. It's a great book, and she's got this, you know, she's a feminist in the 1970s, Ellen Willis, experimenting with like we want to smash the family, basically. It sounds, you know, it sounds bizarre, but like lots of people, you know, people were really seriously trying to overcome the institution of the family at that point. She describes herself. She writes an article in 1979. She says, you know, I thought I was pioneering my way onto this new peninsula, basically. Then a load of people were going to follow me on. We were pioneering the new world of this peninsula. A load of people were going to follow me on. So then I looked behind me, and the social tides had turned. I thought, fuck me, I'm on an island. Not I'm on an island. The tides are still rising, and this island may disappear. And it's a long way back to, you know, the shore of the rest of society. What caused that in 1979 was a real big sort of backlash against the counterculture, and a backlash which gets figured by things like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. A lot of their attraction at the time, none of that attraction was about neoliberal policies. Nobody was attracted to the fucking privatisation of British Rail or anything like that. People were attracted to the idea that, or certain people were attracted to the idea that, look, we've had enough of this fucking chaos, basically. You know, the left didn't look as though it could push on and change the world, so what we were left with was, you know, people not behaving in the way they want, etc. So repression of the counterculture was a really big draw for that backlash. And the war on drugs, which started by Nixon, you know, in the early 70s, absolutely clear that people who drew that up. The war on drugs was to defeat the counterculture and the Black Power movements. Basically, it was an excuse for that. They were interested in nothing else about drugs. That's what it was for. And of course, we've seen the level of repression that comes with that. You know, the hundreds of thousands of people who are in prison. Yeah, thanks. So I think you can see that the counterculture begins to fall away, or begins to come under pressure through repression and people, you know, not wanting this experimentation and the sort of chaos that it brings. But it really, you know, there's a big recession in the UK throughout most of the 1980s. Only gets really resolved in like 1988, and that's the point at which I think a lot of people who were on their islands in, like, you know, the huge amount of squatting in London, etc., involved in all of it, you know, perhaps they were narco-punks or whatever at that point, living a life on the dole, basically, which I did for a few years, and was the aspiration of all right-thinking people at that time. That all gets cut away by a whole series of things, such as conditionalities on benefits, but primarily, of course, it gets cut away by the rising house prices, which like eliminate squatting, but also eliminates the ability to drop out in any sort of form, and also increases the real drive to drop in. Basically, you can see everyone's getting like fucking free money everywhere you've got a house, you know. which you're not going to get any other point. So, like to sum up, I think one of the will can a counterculture emerge now? Yeah, probably can do. But the counterculture of like the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, they had material underpinnings. The material underpinnings were partly a really strong, much stronger left. Cultural underpinnings were, welfare state, a lot of spaces in cities, etc., etc. This stuff which is unlikely to come back in the immediate term, unless Corbyn pulls a miracle out of his magic bag. I think that's one of the useful things of when we look back is to see that there are material underpinnings, and the material underpinnings allowed this huge explosion of creativity and freedom for working class kids. Which is why I think we do need a counterculture in order to try to have some sort of control over extended control over our lives, etc. But the real problem is, even if we get that, if we get a new counterculture going, we manage to get into a nice virtuous circle where we can extend the material underpinnings of that freedom, is that will people once again be prepared to charge off on new experiments? And what are the dangers of that? The dangers of that are you look behind you and you're on an island with a receding shoreline. That's my conclusion to that. I want to have, so basically from here I wanted to have people talk about, you can make responses to that if you like, but also to talk about capitalist realism, acid communism, stuff that reading capitalist realism meant to them. A sort of reading group of capitalist realism is what I was thinking, so raise your hands if anyone's got anything to say. Always gets a clap, raise your hands.
I've got something to say. Yeah, I really like what you said. Just one thing I was thinking, that kind of the peninsula metaphor, and then the example from the Weather Underground and the taking the acid, and it's kind of the role, like what the Weather Underground were trying to do in your telling, which I agree with, is create a sharp distinction. This is us, this is them, and kind of sharpen that antagonism. Whereas I can't remember Ellen, the feminist, I can't remember, that idea was she wanted to not have she wanted to lead society, and the problem for her was when tides came up and she was cut off, which is almost the opposite of what the Weather Underground were going to do. It's just kind of an observation, which is worth thinking about.
I want to sound like the most ridiculous human on the planet for a second. I kind of think that if there's a counterculture emerging at the moment, it kind of comes from the kink and poly discourse, and I know it's actually from feminist discourse about actual emotional conversation. You're talking about acid, and that's the question, right? They're forming groups that are able to understand each other emotionally in a way that they can't understand the wider society, to try and prefigure other ideas of interacting in a world where that's been robbed by the market state or whatever, or the bureaucratic state that they were kind of worried about. I think the most interesting versions of that right now are Tumblr, basically, and they're all the kind of, but it's actually giving us an outlook and a useful way of responding to very deep-seated and important criticisms of patriarchy and our own, each of our internalized patriarchy, and that within. Mandy by itself in the early 90s, yeah, you go and rave. But Mandy, when you've got a culture of talking about your emotions, is a different thing. And the same for acid and mushrooms, whatever else.
I just really wish that Mark was still around to be there on the night of the election, really. Because in a way, most people were like, this result is unbelievable, right? And it was unbelievable from the position of capitalist realism. Right? So if you are a capitalist realist, this result is literally unbelievable, and yet it's happened, and we are here, and it's happening now. Do you know what I mean? I really fucking wish you'd been there to see that, because I think it finally put to death some of the things that capitalist realism relies on, left-wing ideas are more popular, and people don't care about other people, and the young don't care about politics. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like that moment was definitely a kind of defining one in that shift. But I also think that obviously making that happen to some extent was reliant on a pre-existing counterculture. So like people like Stormzy, because like the Beatles were reliant on Abbey Road. Yeah, not everyone had access to Abbey Road. It was fucking expensive. Now you can make beats on an iPhone, like on an iPhone or something. Do you know what I mean? And so lots more people can make music, get a platform. You know, and grime and hip hop, like Kendrick Lamar is arguably a 21st century monolith. So Stormzy, do you know what I mean? And so that result, which was unbelievable from a capitalist realist perspective, was reliant on an existing counterculture within music, which I think kind of, in that way that Mark saw that relationship as like between culture and politics in that way, proved that, you know, the slow cancellation of the future hadn't actually happened, and that it could produce the new, and finally put a death to, you know, capitalist realism. So I just wish you were here.
Yes.
So I'm really interested in the
Can you speak up a bit?
so I'm really interested in the that brilliant metaphor which we were talking about, the peninsula becoming an island metaphor, as a description of the experience of undertaking political struggle and consciousness changing in your own life, and then having your means of social reproduction and your movement and your political and social networks recede from you, and the ones of capitalism rise like, you know, toxic. And I'm also really interested in this question of understanding where we are now in terms of these cycles of counterculture and also cycles of events. I agree with the framing of our event being the financial crisis. I certainly feel like that resonates with my own life and my understanding of the world. And I'm also interested in and in agreement with this idea of the recent election being some kind of event or sub-event within that, and what that could potentially be generating. So I'd be interested to talk about, firstly, have we here experienced something like, or in what ways have we here experienced something like that? Peninsula becoming an island. I feel like I've experienced that. After I graduated university, I did what everyone else I knew did, which was sign on. And I was on the dole for a few years. And during that time, my partner and I thought that he was going to go to prison for some political activity. Didn't. And I got a job. And now I've kind of retreated to like the academy, and I'm like paying my bills with PhD stipend, which feels like it hasn't really got anything to do with my politics. I feel like, I've kind of retreated, like I'm trying to retreat back into society in order to be able to survive. But wanting to like create a different world and create a different culture and like lend myself to whatever's emerging, whatever's about to emerge. And so I'd be interested to hear whether like other people, in what ways other people feel like they've been through those kind of experiences in terms of their own social reproduction, in terms of their own political trajectories and relations to kind of culture and the movements that they're a part of, and where we feel like we could take that together in this
I wanted to address the questions you were asking about counterculture and counterculture in a sense coming to an end and whether we need that now. Because I'm slightly more sceptical about the necessity of a counterculture now politically. I think in a sense there are historical reasons why counterculture doesn't exist anymore, and the political lesson we need to draw is to understand that. The cycles that you mentioned, the 13-year cycles, I mean, the one that affected me and affected Mark the most directly was the rave scene of the 90s, especially, you know, things like Jungle and the drum and bass scene, and that kind of formed a lot of my politics in the 20s. And I was quite astonished that a decade of literally month-on-month innovation, literally the records getting faster and faster, just kind of stopped and just whited out almost in the early 2000s. And for me, I think one of the things that's very connected to that is the digitization of music and of art and culture in general, which has the effect of actually just making everything instantly accessible. You know, when I was young, I read about bands like Can in the Melody Maker, and if I was lucky, I'd find someone older brother who would be able to give me a vinyl LP and I'd listen to it, you know. Now, you can just look up anything, and that creates a whole load of new possibilities. I'm not one of these kind of, oh God, kids these days people. It's great that they've got that. But also the fact it's not difficult, there's no friction anymore, means that nothing ever, a counterculture in the old way can't form. The moment something new happens, everybody finds out about it, including the man, you know? Everybody finds out about it. Now, the final point I'd make is, I think I was sitting there watching the election results thinking, fuck, if only Mark had got to see this and got to see all these, you know, these smuggernauts eating their books. That you'd love that. And the role of pop culture in the Corbyn phenomenon, I think, was very important. But it's kind of interesting here because grime is not like, you know, well, there's those people who do grime over there and those normies over here. It is quite woven into the sort of things young people listen to. And similarly, the kind of the "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn" chant was like, you know, football culture, terrace culture, festival culture, all wrapped up together in this. There was an amazing little video of kids outside a nightclub in Newcastle chanting it, you know, at 2 in the morning on a Friday. So I think that a new politicised culture won't come as something that sets itself as an alternative to normie mainstream culture in the way that when I was a kid was how you did things. And I think actually the breakdown of that binary is a good thing, because it means that the radicalizing impulses flow through the whole of the social body and aren't kind of, you know, marked off in alternative spaces and quarantined, which leads to the peninsula problem that we were discussing earlier.
I like what you said there. I was thinking about things like vaporwave. Don't know if anybody's heard of that. But that possibly you can't have that kind of mass counterculture movement anymore because of this kind of dilution through technology, but not necessarily that dilution is bad. You can have themes like radicalism, like political music, but it will never coalesce as that kind of mass counterculture in the way it did before because of these technological advances, basically what you said. I also wanted to pick up on the Corbyn thing, just not feeling that at all.
Jeremy Corbyn?
No, let me. And I think rereading Capitalist Realism a few months ago, I think it's alive and well. And actually this idea that Corbyn represents as radical alternative, it's this notion that capitalism can now be socially just, it can be ethical. And that to me is capitalist realism. It's very much part of this idea that there is no alternative. So what we're going to do is we're going to grow our own veg, but we're still going to, you know, post a photo about us growing our own veg on our fucking iPhone, because that's how it works, and that's us, that's me being radical, and that's not good enough. And capitalist realism is about the eradication of that and making those connections. And Corbyn for me, Labour's it's a very different situation in Scotland. So you talk about this event, it's very interesting. Culturally, for Scottish people, the event was the referendum. That means nothing to you. It would have had an impact had the British state been broken up. That would have been a very interesting conversation, series and things like that. So events are also territorial, and they have cultural distinctions. And this is important. We have to remember that when we're talking here, too.
Great, thanks. Got Nadia.
So I'm really interested in Mark's idea about like the privatization of anxiety and how that relates to counterculture and community and whether people think they can actually win and what winning means. So when Judy was talking about like her being interested in stories of like retreat, I think that the privatization of anxiety is kind of one of those retreats where people effectively can't see a way out or can't see a commonality with others, and so it becomes about taking care of the self and this kind of like internalized sort of way of looking at things. But I'm also interested, and I will give a comradely challenge to Nick's point about sort of how this relates to like communities of polyamory, etc. Because I think a lot of the politics around some of these groups are actually a retreat as well. To me, a lot of it is about we can't see how we can win, and I think there's a conflation that we have to accept about what winning is in terms of counterculture now and previously, because now sort of the socioeconomic reality that people live through is so stark that the only way that you can realize yourself in a counterculture is to be able to live, whereas I think previously people could sign on to the dole, etc. But now you kind of have to find some way of making ends meet. So I think some of those communities have actually said, well, we can't see how we can win those basic things, so we have to kind of take care of this group of people. And I do worry a little bit that some of the politics around that is kind of like, well, if there's a moment of like a tipping point, I want to know that everyone is going to hold hands and kind of jump together. And I think there's a little bit of politics around like some of those communities which becomes about taking care of a small group because of kind of anxiety as a way of not just taking care of the self. So it's like one step out, but it's not reaching out to people on a kind of very basic level. So that's not to diss like polyamory communities in any way, but to say it's interesting what the psychology of it is. And I think there is a contrast between the looking in and looking out, and how that kind of relates to hope as well.
Well, I've got a bit of a list, a bit of a stack actually. So I've got Sam, Nick, Callum, Stephen, Tim, and then Simon. So we've got it's big sausage. Yeah.
Surprise, surprise.
We've got about half an hour left, although we're not going to get checked out of the room, are we? So we can as much as we want, I suppose, but keep them relatively short.
Yeah, I've been interested in what a lot of comrades have been saying, generally, like, a lot of good responses to Mark's work, and I think, like stuff that James is saying about counterculture, and I would take a little bit of issue with Keir in just that you're saying about, I don't think that, the 60s, the acid culture of the 60s was more or less political than the rave culture and ecstasy in the early 90s. I think it is, because it's not one driving the other, is it? The times of making the thing and the thing shapes the times, and then you've got, rave culture was deeply political, I think, and it did, I think what you were saying there was really, it did change a lot of consciousness, and I think that's what Mark's point is about how counterculture changes consciousness, which then can lead to political action or maybe not. And in terms of like what's happening now, I think it's, I'm sorry to say this to people, but like grime is not a youth culture, right? Like in the real sense of in the time period that youth culture moves on. So Solid Crew like dropped 21 Seconds in 2001, right? You're talking about the grime artists are old. They're old men, right? In youth cultural terms, and what you have seen in terms of a change, I think, is a change into, because grime was the last bit of that hardcore continuum. You can see its roots in garage, you can see its roots in jungle, you can see where it's coming from. And I totally agree with Mark, it was a very uncreative time. He says like the 2000s were like, since the 50s we hadn't had such a lack of creativity in terms of music. But what you have got changing is a rapid increase in individualization, of alienation, of lack of political moment for the left and so on. So what happens with counterculture, like people are saying, is it's not even a counterculture, and sometimes, and it's not even very, and it's very individualized and not collective, but it's almost through that it's false that something new will come. Like right now, like what kids are listening to in London anyway is drill, UK drill, or some people call it trap, right? And it's extremely individualistic, it's extremely capitalist, it's hyper materialist, it's all about smoking bare weed and shanking bare mans and and fucking bare women, right? That's what it's about. But and its drug of choice is codeine. It's an escape drug. It's about like numbing the pain, right? So, but through that extreme individualism is then we return to community, ironically, because you start getting people asserting themselves as individuals in defiance of social norms, and then you find a lot of people asserting themselves as individuals in spite of social norms. And I think there is a sense in which that extreme neoliberalism will eat itself, or potentially could, if used in the right way. And I think there will, basically what I'm saying is there's going to be like a drill star who does drill, but with some conscious stuff.
Conscious drill.
Yeah.
Woke drill. We're waiting for you for that.
So I'm clearly not English. Hopefully that's really obvious. The way it's
now.
It is now. So there isn't one subculture. Like one of the things that shits me about Marx, because actually sometimes I really disagree with him. There isn't a subculture in each period. Like the search for a singular cultural moment that can fucking save us it's a crock of shit. Like actually, like I'm a nerd. I come from nerd culture. I'm a proud fucking nerd. Like
an Australian nerd as well, the worst sort.
But like, I'm sorry, but like for me, 2000 AD, all the creative explosion in comic books through in response to Thatcher was pure genius. Like actually, like in the early 2000s, it wasn't a barren wasteland. Like I was in a zine scene in Australia where like hundreds of people would come together and exchange, crafted volumes of poetry or text or whatever by hand, or swap tapes. Some of the music I heard, the tape culture, like I was in a radio show where basically we took two studios and looped them together and turned everything into an instrument. And then like we'd have the only people who'd listen to us were bakers who were awake at 3 a.m. because it was the only time they give us a studio. But like the idea that there's one subculture, I was in at least a dozen subcultures simultaneously. I had goth friends, I had people who were into industrial music. I total like Dungeons and Dragons nerds I'd hang with. Like I had like mad scenes everywhere. Like now is one of the best times for science fiction that's ever existed. It's like insane. Like I just think the idea that there's one thing going on and that we need to look to, I think, is politically and culturally dangerous. Like it has to be pluralism all the time, different tempos, different speeds, different spaces. Like I think to look for one thing and then the return of it is to look for a savior. It might not be a Corbyn savior, but it's a cultural savior. It's some sort of moment that will transform everything and everyone. And like if we're talking about multiple cultures, we're talking about multiple events, and we can't talk about queer polyamory, which I agree is like one of the most fecund sort of spaces we have. We can't talk about that without talking about HIV and AIDS. That's the event that decimated a generation. And if we're talking about like events, then we're talking about organizations. It's not the weatherman, it's ACTA. Like I don't like there are so many scenes, and we're standing in one right now. That I think we need to shatter. Like if acid does something, it shatters perspective. Let's not look for one thing. Like let's be open to the range of different cultural experiences that are going on. Like even to the long-lived ones. Like goth is still going. Goth's not dead, which is ironic.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of like Peninsula Island thing is quite interesting, right? Because I think we want to be, I think there's something really to be said for the fact that we don't have countercultures forming in the same way. but instead I think what we might have is the possibility of certain like mass countercultures generating themselves really rapidly. So the only cultural thing I know about is memes, and I think, and what we had in the run up to the election, like a few of us ran this like stupid little project called Junior Shitposting Social Club, which was basically a meme page that just like fairly uncritically just backed Corbyn and slagged off everyone else. And what we had access to immediately was in the month before the election, we had a reach of 30 million people. So at some point in the first month before the election, 30 million people saw stupid little fucking pictures made on like the laptops of 20 friends. And that, like, I don't know what effect it had. I have no idea how you measure that. But that strikes me as a potential that comes out of social media that is kind of like quite remarkable. And it builds on a common subjectivity, which has kind of got like this elements of like the old, when people used to talk about graduate without a future, you know, this kind of like no futurism or like driving down of conditions. It combines like anger that, I mean, there are lots of young grime artists. You've got AJ Tracy, novelist. There are a lot of like young people in that as well. And also like a certain escapism around drugs, which I think mostly comes from like sesh culture, like the humans of the sesh, that kind of thing. So I just love memes. But that happened without, we didn't have a record shop or we didn't have a certain like clothing code or whatever. It was literally just like one platform, and then you could get 30 million people looking at leftist content, right? That strikes me as there's a possibility for a mass counterculture that wasn't historically there.
But does it change ways of living?
I don't fucking know.
Yeah, actually, I was waiting for someone to bring up memes, and also just the role of like irony / humor in general, and like I in whatever. Well, I don't really think there's the word counterculture is like really useful now, but in these like kind of like nested cultures, like musically like breakcore is very like let's like take these like loads of samples and like make it really funny and silly and stuff like that, and then also like vaporwave is like making something like a really accelerated version of something through like humorous aesthetics and like memes. And memes is definitely like something that's actually quite niche, because I realize when I talk to like non-leftists that like they just look at totally different memes or just not look at memes at all. Like we communicate so much through memes. And just I don't know, obviously I'm quite young, so I don't know about like the generations before, although like I can like consume some of the stuff that was created. But I think humor and irony in like a bad way, sometimes to distance yourself where it's like, oh, it's all good because it's like, you know, it's like ironic, bro. And like, for example, that's also kind of like reflected in like how drag culture is also developing and stuff like that. So like the role of humor and irony is getting quite big in like the way that these like niche cultures are developing, I think.
Stephen.
One thing I want to add is I'm thinking about the reception of capitalist realism and how it's came as a part of that moment of sort of the emergence of zero books. So I always read it alongside Nina Power's book, along with One Dimensional Woman, and how they fit together, and how there was a moment of trying to take certain kinds of, let's say, emerging net culture, and then have a different mode of publishing and interacting that sort of was a book, but wasn't like a big weighty book, so it was like this sort of in-between zone. So I would say it wasn't really an island or a peninsula, it was more like trying to build an archipelago, so different sort of moments that connect it. And I think that was really interesting, and also because I think in some ways, you might say, back to the generational thing, that it was like the echo of like 90s cyberculture coming back and saying, well, what can we do with this? So if you look at who started Zero, it was all people who like were at Warwick in the mid-90s, right? So Mark and Matteo and Tariq, and so how these things echo and then sort of build upon themselves as they sort of get reiterated.
Yeah, I think like there's sometimes a tendency to kind of overemphasize, basically in this discussion. I think it's possible to kind of overemphasize like the influence of like sort of like cultural movements on the like political thing, and I think this can like dangerously kind of like reproduce some of the sort of like right-wing ideas that are used to basically like dismiss, like, you know, like, so for example, like you know, if you can read in like the Times or whatever that young people don't really like Jeremy Corbyn. It's just cool to like him, and they're not really making a kind of like actual political choice. And I think, like, just as an example of this, I mean, I think if you take acid, basically, I think it's like, so yes, you had like the Weather Underground doing lots of acid, and other smaller groups who used to take shitloads of acid and then go and smash up like rich areas in New York. But you also had, you know, like, you've got to free your mind instead, and like you know, like Timothy Leary and all these sort of people who were like not at all political. Basically, that was probably like the mainstream. And if you look at how people, if you go to some sort of festival like Shambhala or something and listen to how people talk when they're taking acid now, I think it's really like totally apolitical and, for me anyway, not very much about like consciousness expanding or anything like that. So I think, yeah, like the Weather Underground were political, I think, because of the political experience they went through, and maybe acid had something to do with that. And the same thing, I think we should more draw like why young people are political today. It's more important to like point to, like, you know, the material factors, the like total loss of belief in like capitalism, the inability of capitalism to provide people's material needs, rather than saying like, oh, it's all the memes and the like, you know, the kids are just down with what's cool or whatever.
I might talk a little bit about what it says on the tin. I fucking love acid. But
Somebody turn that camera around.
But what I've also found in terms of mental illness is that, and then also the capitalist realisms that I feel are inside so many people, that a lot of people can't do acid nowadays, or really fucking shouldn't. And also, strangely, when talking about mental illness and then also talking about Mark, I also don't want to encourage like further responsibilizations of like how fucking surprising and also how bad everyone obviously felt at the beginning of this year. But everybody, let's like fucking take care of each other and check up on each other, and we like, I think there's signifiers and signs that we can see around this stuff sometimes, and that we should just say hello every once in a while and check in with people, because it's super, super, super fucking important. Of course, I just wanted to say that. Everyone knows it, of course, but I think it should be raised in something like this.
Yeah, I want to kind of bring, like, for me, the people like Leary and all that stuff that we're kind of excluding, all of that side of the 60s counterculture. The best thing about the 60s for me, or all of those kind of like opening up moments, is that's their, like what you were saying about like multiple cultures. It's a kind of, we need like that messy, like visceral, all of those bits about kind of this society is trying to kind of like sanitize out of us, like, and I think what you said about kind of like all of those points in the past that enabled that were a certain amount of security. You were able to take that risk of opening up because you had, like, there was something, some form of culture or some form of kind of framework that enabled you. Whereas now, I think we're all those islands. We are kind of like taking that risk, like you said. It's fucking, it'd be like much more dangerous psychically, setting and all of that. You know, like where you are when you take these things to open up, or what, and yeah, and I still think we're living under that moment, those 50s and 60s. We're definitely still living within it. Like,
Craig.
What?
Put your hand up.
Am I not at the end of the stack?
You are, but then the stack is there. I'll go over here first. You compose your thoughts.
I guess I was just going to reflect on the last time that I read Realism, and it was in kind of relatively interesting circumstances. I read it with doctors who were psychiatrists in South London, so more like radical and left-wing than most doctors. So in a way it's positive that they read it at all, but then the discussions that we had left me feeling quite frustrated because of the lack of imagination and the lack of responses for, I guess, alternatives in terms of modes of care responsibility of us as professionals to expand our reach within society in general. And also, even in things like how do we as doctors resist the kind of organisational structures of the NHS, we didn't really have any communal solutions to things like that. So I guess it's like, how can we use the messages of capitalist realism in like organised professional structures, and is that possible?
I mean, I think Mark was sort of, when he was really interested in consciousness raising group, he was seeing that as like not just groups of friends, but like work colleagues, as the first basis for the. Craig, are you ready for us?
Yeah, I think.
It's a shit posting maybe now.
Something's gone wrong with my phone.
Fuck, sorry. Cramp.
I'll skip my arm now.
Shake it out.
Take your time.
Sorry. I fucking hate sitting on the grass. I'm kind of allergic to the countryside, and a lot of people in fancy know that. It's really horrible.
Well, we came here.
On that note, it's kind of funny for me learning about the Acid Communism project. One of the things that I always thought I had in common with Mark was that we both shared a disdain for hippies and for peace and love and all that sort of 60s counterculture. Like, I'm still not convinced by it. I mean, but I did find it interesting how you said you talked about acid, Keir, as being a drug that's not just about kind of like the plasticity of things, which I don't know tends to lead into sort of hippie. That's out of my comfort zone. Let's say that way. But acid as being kind of a drug that's about like us and them. Like there's a sort of like once you've tuned in, then everyone else is kind of like straight culture and everything. And then I was thinking about what Tim said about politics of care and stuff, and I was thinking, what would a kind of a communist movement, it's like an acid communist movement, like be about? And I think that that's really a key. One of the things that capitalist realism I think produces, and particularly the thing that Nadia said about like the idea that we can't win, produces, is that there's a relationship to communism which ends up being just ironic or like nihilistic or arrogant, smug and nautic, as Mark would say. And there's this bit in Capitalist Realism where he talks about like a crack in the veil, and some people sort of debate as whether like Corbyn's like the crack in the veil. I think the one crack in the veil can be like developing this idea of like a politics of care, or the slogan that without care and justice victory is not possible. And I'm just sort of riffing here. I haven't really prepared anything. I felt like I wanted to say something because I care about Mark a lot. But we can't ignore that, towards the end of his life, Mark ends up, embroiled in like a really horrible and toxic left culture. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I do think that. Sorry, I feel a bit emotional. I think like a politics of care is really important, and that's one way of defining our communism against a kind of like a sardonic, nihilistic, not serious communism. I was actually just sat here thinking, I hardly know anyone here. I kind of like, I've never done acid. I'd love to do acid with everyone right now. I don't like the countryside.
You would after you did the acid.
People. sit together and have a good experience.
You'd love it.
Can we sort it out?
We did spike the pasta.
All that.
So the thing is, you're not actually in the countryside.
But I think maybe one way of tearing open that crack in the veil and forming a communism which is a productive us and them rather than a sort of oppositional us and them, is that our communism will be about looking after each other and care, and it's not that we can sort of vanish capitalism away. And I think one of my skepticisms towards acid has always been that kind of like dropping out, like ignoring what's going on. That's why I've always been kind of like politically right-on way is like stimulants, because you've got to just throw yourself at it. But so like Mark and I disagreed on politics a lot. Sorry, music a lot more than politics. Particularly like rock music, which he said was progressive and he was wrong. But one thing we did agree on was The Jam, a band from the late 70s, early 80s. And there's this line that starts the beginning of the song Town Called Malice, which is a very famous song, but like it gets sort of drowned out by organs and people don't really listen to the words, which are actually really profound. And it says, we better stop dreaming of the quiet life because it's the one we'll never know, and quit running for that runaway bus because rosy days are few, and stop apologising for the things you've never done, because life is cruel, time is short, and it's up to us to change this town called Malice. And particularly when we live in what feels sometimes like quite a malicious left culture, I think it is up to us to change it, and I think that would be one part of my acid communism.
That's where we're going to leave it. That's a great end. You better top that.
I've come dressed in my best hippie clothes to annoy Craig. And I think that what you just said about and this is quite more of a hippie and acid comment, but I think it's worth thinking about, because the stuff that happened to Mark, the kind of, I know there's been some kind of discussion around where's solidarity gone, and why are we not looking at what we have in common? Why is the left fighting over the minutiae of difference rather than the way that we are all oppressed or experience oppression and coming together? And in terms of the effects of different kinds of drugs, what acid and psychedelics do to your kind of consciousness is this idea of like dissolution of ego, and people are taking it. In general, that's something that people experience, whatever their politics are. You kind of go, ooh, I feel quite connected to all of these people, and that's the kind of hippie experience. And I think it's what you do with that. If you are quite apolitical, you can just not do anything with that. But I think it's a really interesting facilitation of this community of care, that we can use that understanding that there is a way of being in a community that is more connected, and that's why I think it's a useful thing. Because in a kind of a hippie way, I think that it has made me feel more invested in looking after my comrades and in what we do have in common. So although it is perhaps that kind of that very, I think it's really useful. I think that idea of a kind of more of a community consciousness and understanding is very integrated into that culture, but it just has to be used in the correct way. And I've sort of drawn a lot of comparisons with the kind of kickback against the very vicious stuff that was mentioned in the paper last night, and the way that people talk about the kind of history culture. I think there were good things to be drawn from that. And other drugs like cocaine, for example, are hyper individualistic, and they're all about your whole self, and they change your consciousness in very different ways, and there are useful things in all of them, but I think that's certainly something that we can use in a useful way.
Any more?
I had a really quick point that's been going around my head while people were talking, and I've just been thinking about the role of the festival. It feels like when I was younger there was like a few key festivals to go to, and now that's kind of multiplied quite a lot, and apparently there's like a politics festival now. But also just this idea of that they kind of like see these spaces where people kind of let go quite a lot and become like quite maybe different to kind of their everyday lives, but actually that's like a bit weird to have them in these really confined spaces over kind of 4 days of a calendar a year where people can, and whether that's kind of been used to kind of, I guess, squash quite a lot of this subculture to package it in a safe way, but yeah.
Yeah, so I know it's been mentioned before, but yeah, one thing about something Mark said about those.
Could you talk up, please?
Sorry?
Could you talk louder?
Sorry. Something about those 13-year cycles and the counterculture thing is that the whole idea that it does completely privilege this one art form, music. Music's the art form, and that's the site of the new. That's where you find the new. I'm not sure, and I don't think that's necessarily at all correct anymore, but that doesn't mean the new went away. You know, there's art forms that didn't exist when the first of those cycles came around, like, well, you know, memes were mentioned. I think about computer games, which have also, like, one didn't exist when those cycles happened, and since they've very changed immeasurably. But I think, and yeah, the idea that there's one overriding counterculture that has anything, but I think the idea that of culture as mechanism of exploration of what the world could be different, because of course if we do actually win, and we therefore change the material relations and the social relations between us all, that necessitates alterations of consciousness. Which is why I find the idea of acid communism interesting, because it's an idea of thinking, well, what alterations of consciousness are we going to need? Because that is it's an alteration of the material reality. These aren't two separate things. And I think Mark was really right that culture is where you look at how people are probing that and developing it. I think I sound like I have more to say than I did. Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Sorry, can I just say something that I think is really interesting about the idea about community and care? And this is a community, but it's a community of a certain kind of privilege, because everybody here has been able to choose it and come to it outside. And I'm in a community where people are stuck together, and I'm here because an organisation in my community paid for me to come here, and that's why I'm on my own. So they don't have that privilege. So their community it has solidarity, but it's kind of ugly. And you know, I've been jumped in my local area by the young team for 3 weeks earlier. I ran a youth workshop. They still jumped me. Brilliant. And I have to go back. So it's ugly, and poverty and class is racist, and it's sexist, and it's misogynist, and it's horrible. But there's solidarity there, there's care in that too. So it's also about those kind of communities that we have to allow in, because we have to make a challenge to those ideas that are prevalent. And sometimes it's really ugly. I mean, this community is lovely, this whole vibe is beautiful, and everyone's dead nice and wants to know who you are, but walking about a scheme, it's not like that. But these are people, you know, isn't just an abstract idea. These people live real lives, and they have everyday acts of solidarity and care. But it maybe doesn't fit a kind of certain model, but it's still there. So it's maybe just to be mindful of those things as well.
Any more for any more? Let's call it a day. Thanks for that really good discussion.